Hello, I'm Melissa Ojeda, the Marketing and Public Relations Manager for Green Canyon Conservancy, the official nonprofit partner of Grand Canyon National Park. And we work hand in hand with the Park Service to provide educational opportunities and digital programming to keep you connected to Grand Canyon. And so thanks to your ongoing support, we are able to share this new series, History Behind the Arts, providing you an in-depth look at the Cultural Demonstrator program at Grand Canyon. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you the Cultural Demonstrator Program Coordinator, Grace Lilly.
Hi, thank you for joining us today. We have the pleasure of talking with Lyle Balenquah, a Hopi natural stone and shell jeweler. He's joining us today from his home in Bacavi on Third Mesa in northeast Arizona. Lyle is not only a jeweler, but an archaeologist and outdoor guide. Lyle has spent a great deal of time outside learning from the land, from his ancestors, and through his time as an archaeologist. The jewelry he creates reflects the techniques, styles, and pieces that his ancestors created many generations before him. Thank you for joining us today, Lyle.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Well, I would love to hear, Lyle, if you could share a little bit about yourself and what drew you into jewelry making.
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, I'm from the village of Bacavi on Third Mesa. I come from the Greasewood clan, and I've been an archaeologist. That's what I went to university for. So I have both my bachelor's and master's degree in archaeology from Northern Arizona University. And for over 20 years or so, that's been the main thing that I've been doing here in the Southwest, is working in the field of archaeology. But as you stated, yes, I've expanded that into other realms where I'm able to incorporate not only my academic training, but also my cultural understandings and education and teachings that have been handed to me. So really those two things are the archaeology and then just me being an outdoor kind of person, both really influence, how it is that I came to be involved in doing, this type of jewelry work. And so it's been a really interesting journey for me in terms of being able to see firsthand in the archaeological record the various types of jewelry that my ancestors and different types of groups were making here in the Southwest. And that's really what piqued my interest. Is back around 2006 maybe, I was working on an excavation project in north central Arizona. And during that project, we were encountering a lot of fragments of what we know as pipestone. It's called argillite in its technical term, but it's a really soft shale kind of rock material, and it's locally available there in the Verde Valley area. And so the site we were working on just had an above average amount of this material. And it really piqued my interest because the type of material we were finding was really dark red, maroon red. It has a nice, soft, silky feel to it. It just really kind of appealed to me in terms of how it looked, how it felt, and how easily it was to be able to work with. And so following that project, I just followed that interest and really started looking into what the material is, where it's found, and then how my ancestors were using it, not only to make jewelry, but you can make pigments out of it and things of that nature. And so I spent probably maybe a handful of years, 3, 4, 5 years, really just kind of going down that rabbit hole of investigating and researching this particular type of material. But, you come to find out that just like any other kind of artistic medium, my ancestors were incorporating a lot of different other materials with it, like shell and turquoise. And so we never really found anything really unique like that was a full, complete piece, at least in the project we were working on. But through the research and just going to museums and other visitor centers, I could see the range of, the different types of products and jewelry that they were making, incorporating all of this different type of turquoise and shell and other types of minerals. So for me, that's really kind of where it started. It's just doing my own personal kind of interest in it, really trying to get an understanding of for me, being not only an archaeologist but coming from the Hopi side, it's important for me to really get a good understanding of the process of how these types of objects are made. So I think within archaeology, we all kind of pick our specialty or our specific focus of study. I never really did that when I was in undergrad or graduate school. I just kind of went through the process. But following that, jewelry and those types really became what piqued my interest in all of this. And so for me, that was just a way to get the hands-on experience of really understanding how these types of pieces are made and the type of patience and skill, dedication, and the time requirements, to do this type of work. Not only for me, of course, I have some modern tools at hand that speed up the process, but in the very beginning, I was using basically a hand saw, a metal file, some sandpaper, and sandstone to shape the various, pipestone that I was working with. And so that gave me a better appreciation for just how much time and effort, and skill that it takes for these artisans of the past to be able to produce these types of materials. So it's both been, enlightening in that perspective of giving me that insight into the process of it, but now it's turned into, kind of I used to call it a hobby, but it's slowly becoming more and more part of my life. And it's something that has opened a lot of different doors for me. And it's something that I want to pursue more as I go into the future. So this is an example of an early piece that I made. So when I'm talking about the red pipestone, this is what I'm talking about, this type of material. And it's a basic inlay. I thought I was, at the top of my game when I was making things like this, because for me, this was a big achievement, to be able to actually get the raw material, cut it and shape it, and then produce something. And this is pretty similar to what you would see, in the archaeological record. And so, that's kind of how I started off, is just doing basic, kind of inlay things, coming from archaeology, my cultural background, combining all that, and just happenstance of this one chance project that exposed me to it really brought me to where I'm at today.
For sharing, Lyle. Well, if you don't mind, you mentioned that you use pipestone a lot, but other materials that help make the pieces, if there's different stone materials, as well as I believe you also use some really neat cottonwood.
Yeah, so this is the Cottonwood Root. It's a fairly soft material and it's really lightweight. So this is a material that I'm able to collect myself. Being a river guide, either up on the San Juan River or other rivers that I work on, it's something that I'm always collecting, and my other river guide friends like to joke with me because I'm always the guy that has the big tree strapped to the back of my boat, as I'm going downriver. But it was first used, mainly used for kachina doll carving here by a lot of carvers out here at Hopi. I'm able to have access to this material, pretty easily. I collect it for the carvers here at Hopi. I'm able to share it with them. But also for my purpose, it's just a really good lightweight material. It has a really uh, neat grain, beautiful grain to it. And so once you get that cut and sanded and polished, and then I can either leave it in its raw form or sometimes I'll stain it, and that'll help bring out the grain. And so it can have a metaphor behind it, cottonwood being associated with water. That's something, of course, that's pretty scarce and unique here in the Southwest. And so when you look at the metaphorical um, meaning behind the work that I do, I'm incorporating all of these other types of materials into it, like turquoise and seashell, that are also have water metaphors associated with them. So in a way, you can look at it as like a silent prayer for moisture. Whoever is wearing that piece of jewelry, they're exhibiting, a silent prayer to have that come and be a part of their lives. So yeah, cottonwood root is just something I started using early on because I had the readily available access to it. I also use ironwood. Ironwood is a denser type of material. It doesn't grow here in northern Arizona. It's mainly from southern Arizona area. but it has a denser material to it. It's much harder to work with. It actually sinks in water because it has very few air pockets in it as opposed to other types of wood. So it's very much, it's like a dark chocolate color. So it's just, different types of materials and textures that come from the different materials that we use. And there are materials that have been used for, many, many generations. Ironwood, we see cottonwood backing used prehistorically. So it's just following in that tradition, of what my ancestors were doing, 1,000 years ago.
Thank you, Lyle. And can you talk a little bit more about some of the shell and turquoise that you use as well?
So this is one type of shell, that I use. Spiny Oyster, this is the whole specimen here. I really am hesitant to cut into this piece just because it's such a cool, unique whole specimen here. But again, different types of shell like this. And of course, like on this piece again, this is a piece of abalone shell. So um, different types of, whatever shell I can get my hands on. This is a thunderbird that's basically on a piece of clam shell here, the coral piece in the middle. Again, all these different types of materials that have been utilized for thousands, hundreds of years here in the Southwest, having that association with water, the colors, they're vibrant. So there's a lot of metaphorical meaning, behind all the different materials that I utilize. Um, this isn't necessarily a piece of turquoise. This is a piece of chrysocolla, but it's generally similar to the type of turquoise that I'll buy. So I try and get all of my material in its rough form. You can buy finished pieces that are already cut and polished called cabochons, and those you can, inlay into your pieces. But I really try and do my best to get the understanding again of what the process is to utilize this material. So I try and buy it in its rough form as much as possible, and then I'm able to bring it home and cut it and shape it how I really want to use it down the line. So for me, those are really my main types of material. Other types of material are like this is a piece of lapis lazuli. So really it's kind of at the artist's discretion. You look at any kind of jeweler nowadays. There's just a wide spectrum of materials, dinosaur bone, uh, you name it, people are utilizing it. So it's really just a fun kind of experimentation to try and get a handle on how these materials differ, because they do have their personalities. You do have to work with them in different ways. Turquoise is relatively soft. There's some hard material, but for the most part, turquoise is a soft material. So you really have to be patient with it. You really have to pay attention to how you're cutting. A lot of times I'll just look at a piece of the rough and wet it down and try and get a sense of where the fractures are. How am I going to cut this piece to maximize the most amount of material out of it? And sometimes it just doesn't want to, play by the rules, and you kind of got to put it aside. But so yeah, those are the different types of materials that I'm using for the most part: cottonwood root, ironwood, turquoise, and various types of shell, and just whatever other material that I personally am attracted to. I'll pick up a piece and try it out.
Neat. So those are all really unique pieces, Lyle. Thank you so much for sharing. And if you don't mind kind of walking us through the process that it would take you to complete a finished piece of jewelry, so whether it be a pendant or an earring, please feel free to kind of give us a step-by-step idea of how much time it takes you to create a piece of jewelry.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, I'll start off with this piece of wood here. If I'm going to use cottonwood root, and I'll cut it into a section like this. And I used to cut it just in like the cookie cutter fashion to get this type of grain. I'll either do that or I'll split it vertically like this into longer sections, and that gives you just a different grain pattern depending on how you cut the pieces of wood and depending on the size. So I'll get blanks like that, and then eventually I will cut them into smaller pieces, thin, kind of, quarter-inch pieces like this, and shape it to however, I want. So like there's a specific pattern. There's another drop pattern right there, you know. So it's really kind of up to me how I want to, you know, whatever shape I want. This is something I really like to do, and this is a T-shaped doorway, you know, that we see in archaeologically here within the Southwest and across, you know, the Western Hemisphere. So being an archaeologist, you know, this has always been unique to me in terms of its meaning. It does have a specific meaning in Hopi, but so I'll get it to that point. Um, and again, you cut out the, you know, the inlay part where you want to put all your different pieces, and then you basically start cutting and shaping. So from, you know, a big chunk of turquoise, I'll end up with like little inlay rectangles or squares or whatever shape I want, you know. So it just kind of depends on the, how much space I have to work with, and, you know, how I want that specific pattern to go into. So from there, I'll utilize, I have a small trim saw and a Dremel that I'll use to help shape, but I also will shape it sometimes if it's a really soft material and I don't want to chance running it on a piece of machinery. I'll use sandstone, and I'll dip that piece in water and just slowly grind, you know, that piece into whatever shape. Usually I'll have it pretty much roughed out by the time I get to that stage. And so then I'll just go through various um, shaping and kind of sandpapering. I'll go through different grits. I'll usually start off with like 100 grit and then go to 220 and then maybe go to 400, and then I'll go into a 600 wet sandpaper, which is like an automotive sandpaper that they use to do body work. And then I usually finish with like a 1500 or 3000 grit sandpaper. And so that really brings out the shine. And once I have um, once I have all those pieces ready, you know, and they're ready to be inlaid, I use a two-part epoxy, which you know is you squeeze it out and you mix it together. I add a small piece of or small amounts of black acrylic paint just to darken, because it'll be clear when you mix it together. But I add the black acrylic paint just to give it a little bit more background texture to it, so that comes out all of the little seams in the mosaic are, they're kind of contrasted with, you know, the usually bright colors of the turquoise or whatever else I'm using. And I'll set that in, and that's kind of the you know, I that stage of actually doing the inlay is really the part that I need to make sure that I'm not rushed in any way, that, you know, I haven't had too much coffee that morning, that I really have to make sure that everything is laid out and ready to go, because the epoxy sets within 5 minutes. So you have a very short window of time to get everything in there right, start to, you know, move pieces around so they align properly, and really get it to how you want it to look. So I'll generally do maybe just one set of earrings at a time, because I've tried to do, you know, like, okay, I'm going to get real good at this and do maybe 2 or 3 sets of earrings at a time, but that never works out. And so you just have to be willing to be patient, spend the time, and know that it's something that you have to be focused on, and really, you know, set your intention to doing the best work that you can. And so once I get those pieces set in the epoxy, I let that set, and then I'll come back and clean it up. And so on my Dremel tool or my flex shaft, I'll have a small, it's like a rotating wire brush. It's soft bristled, and I'll have that on low speed, and that'll just clean off all the excess epoxy. Usually I'll wipe it down while it's still kind of wet with a slight watered down, like rubbing alcohol. Add a little bit of water in there, and that'll help clean off the surface of most of the excess epoxy as it extrudes, you know, out as you're pushing those different pieces in. But there's always some residue left, and so I come back and clean it up with the wire brush, and then I'll start, if I haven't polished the stones previously, then I'll polish them then. So I'll start that whole sandpaper process once they're set in the stone or whatever backing I'm going to do. And then from there, I'll go to the final polish stage. I use a product called ZAM. It's a hard, kind of chalky polishing material. You put a buffing wheel, you know, on your hand tool, and you just apply it, and it really brings out the shine of the different types of materials. Not all material uh, takes the polish the same way. So some materials I have to go to a higher polishing, or like a higher grit sandstone or sandpaper, like 3000 grit or higher. Things like the fossilized dinosaur bone that I work with, that takes a lot to bring out, a really good polish to it. So then from there, you drill the hole. I do my own wire work. I make my own ear hooks. So by then, you have a finished product, and you're ready to go. So it generally takes me probably 2 to 3 days to actually get through maybe half a dozen pieces, from cutting the wood, doing all the shaping of the wood. And I generally have a stockpile of pre-cut inlay pieces that I may spend a day. That's all I do on the trim saw, is just cut, cut, cut. So that way when I'm ready to go, I can trim those as I need and go forward. But yeah, it'll generally take me about a week maybe to get a handful of pieces done, to where I feel like I'm satisfied with, what I have, and then, we'll start another batch.
Wonderful. Well, that's some really great work you do, Lyle, and it's amazing to hear that whole process. So as you've been creating this unique style of prehistoric jewelry, what are some of the challenges that you've faced trying to kind of have that learning curve and get to where you are today?
Just having the patience, I think, really, I can remember back in the early days when I was in my backyard with like a handsaw, trying to cut a block of pipestone and going through saw blade after saw blade and still not having a slab to work with, and then you start to, it's just an individual process of learning, your patience level, how you go about it. Um, and then again, learning the different materials, and being forgiving with that material, because, I think when I first started, I had this concept that, okay, it's going to be a perfect run from beginning to end. And, I quickly found out that that's not the case. So learning the different aspects of the material, how they react to different types of, machinery, processes, things like that. And, I, that's kind of the technical part of the learning curve. It's just, it takes time to learn each individual material and get a better understanding of it. On the more artistic side, that's the harder. That's kind of the constant struggle for me, is that, you know, is am I an artist? I still, uh, have a hard time labeling myself as that jeweler, because I don't think of myself in that manner. Um, I'm slowly transitioning out of, okay, it's still a hobby, but it's become much more than that. And, things like looking at my early pieces and seeing how far I've come. And this has taken, we're not talking, yesterday. This started in 2006, somewhere around there, when I really started, getting into it. So, 14, 15 years later of constantly learning and trying different materials, experimenting with, all of those things, and trying to push yourself just to get a better understanding of not only the material, but where you stand at, has been, that learning curve for me to really accept that, okay, this is a larger part of who I am, what I want to do now. And so being honest with myself in terms of, okay, if I'm going to be an artist, you can't fake it. You really have to go into it. You have to devote yourself to it, and as much as you can. I still don't do this full time. I still have all my other archaeology and guiding work to do when we could do it. But when things were normal, this is still a part-time kind of thing for me. I'd like for it to become more of what I do, because I enjoy being home. I enjoy being able to create things from my home base, that go, that I've been able to ship things all over the world now. Different pieces are in different countries. And so that's kind of the realization that you go through, in this process, is that you accept that people appreciate what you do, even though you're trying to be humble and you're trying to stay focused on what you're doing, with what you have at hand. I don't have a whole studio setup, you know, basically operating out of my kitchen table and another room. And, you know, I'm working with the basics right now. But for me, that's also part of the process, is that if my inspiration is coming from my ancestral past, and you look at what those folks were creating with the bare minimum, part of my one of my goals is to stay in line with that kind of thought process, that you can achieve good things with basic materials and basic tools at hand, you know. And so for me, that's just me as an individual, kind of, you know, where I've been at as an archaeologist, and trying to stay true to that, but also knowing that, you know, yes, I have a trim saw, yes, I have modern day equipment to help me kind of speed up the process and make things a little bit easier. So, you know, there's both been that technical learning curve of the tools. You know, when I got a trim saw, you know, that took a whole nother, you know, few months to get a handle on, and grinders and things of that nature. So you really have to learn, you know, machinery, how to be safe around it, how it's best used. But then also you translate that to the artistic side, and where you want to take this medium that you're working with. And, you know, just kind of be forgiving with yourself, myself as a jeweler now, knowing that I'm going to make mistakes, knowing that there are some days that I'm better off doing something else. You know, there are some days that even though I want to work on a piece of jewelry, maybe my mindset's not right. Maybe the material doesn't want to cooperate. Maybe we're both fighting each other, you know, and so you just have to put it aside and go do something else, and come back to it at a later time. And then maybe, you know, you made up by then, and you guys, you know, we work hand in hand, so to speak, to make something come together. And so, yeah, it's been a long process of technical, artistic, personal, metaphysical, you know, questioning yourself, and then the confidence level of getting to a point now where I understand the process now. You know, I have a good handle, I think, on the types of jewelry that I want to make, how I get from A to B. I have that in my head. So that takes you up another level, you know. So where do I go with that now? And so for me, you know, something like this is a huge achievement for me, you know, seeing this like in the archaeological record, seeing these in exhibits, you know, in museum centers and things like that. This was kind of scary for me to say, okay, I'm going to attempt that. But once it came to fruition, and actually looking at it, you know, and holding it in your hand, you know, you realize how far you've come, you know, and how much knowledge and experience that and patience you have to be able to get to this point. And so, you know, there's different levels of learning, you know, that are always ongoing, you know, with this process. And so right now, maybe I feel like I'm at a pretty good, stable level. Where am I going to go with that next? And so, you know, we'll see what that leads to.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your amazing developments. And we consider you an artist, and getting to see your amazing creations and new developments come through is really neat, Lyle. But I'd love for you to share a little bit more specifically how you connect to Grand Canyon personally and also culturally as well.
So it's a whole history lesson right there, I guess, but we'll try and condense it. You know, for Hopi people in general, I can't, and again, this is when I'm going to talk about culture, I can only really talk about a specific slice of the pie, so to speak, you know, because Hopi is comprised of many different clans, many different groupings of people that came together over a long period of time to become who we are today as quote unquote Hopi. So for many of us, Hopi is an origin point. You know, it's kind of the beginning of who we are as a people. It's kind of I want to say, you know, in human history in general, we've all recognized that we've gone through certain stages of development. Like we were in the Stone Age, then the Bronze Age, and maybe now we're in the technological age. Those mark advances in different types of humanity. So for Hopi, the Grand Canyon represents one of those stages as maybe the beginning of the stage we're in right now. This kind of the origin of us becoming Hopi, you know, which is a big concept for us in that, of course, you have the confluence area where the Little Colorado River and the Colorado River meet. Upstream of that general region is an actual geographic landmark, that's called Tipapuni. And for Hopi, that's where we conceptualize our beginning of coming from one stage of development, the underworld, into this above ground, the new stage of development. So it's both spiritual, metaphorical, and actual physical, has those kind of meanings to us, because we can look back within the Grand Canyon and see, for thousands of years, Hopi ancestors, other indigenous ancestors, making a living down there, actually doing their day-to-day tasks and living and dying and giving birth and giving, the things that we carry today as Hopi people. We owe some of those material, those ideological, those philosophical, the religion, the ceremony, the language, all of that culture has some connection to the Grand Canyon. And so, you know, that's just to say that it has a lot of different meaning for us as Hopi people, that it's not just a beautiful geographic landscape to go and visit, but when we go there, we're actually entering holy ground where ancestors dwell, right? And so we're actually interacting with a realm that is beyond us as physical human beings. And so, that's kind of the really abstract perspective of what the Grand Canyon means. For me as an archaeologist, I owe a lot to the Grand Canyon, because that's really where I learned a lot about archaeology. The whole northern Arizona region in general, but places like the Grand Canyon, Wapatki, were where I really started to learn a lot about archaeology. And, I took my first river trip in 2002 and spent like maybe 19 days working along the river corridor. And that really opened my eyes to, what is the Grand Canyon all about? Before then, I was just like any other tourist. My dad would take me and we'd go to the rim and, wow, look at that. And then maybe we'd hike down for a little bit. But it wasn't until much later that, actually spending that intimate time along the river corridor opened my eyes to just the larger experience of what the Grand Canyon means to Hopi people. And then later on in subsequent trips, both archaeology and cultural trips, and then working as a guide, you come to know more, on an intimate level, the various environments and landscapes of the Grand Canyon. And so you really get to see how our ancestors were coexisting within that landscape. And so for me, that's what I try and convey to my family, my relatives, my community members, is that, yeah, it's a real cool place that I think a lot of us go to as tourists, but we also need to understand that there's a lot more meaning behind it. And I encourage folks, whether they're indigenous or not, to really try and understand, that it's hard on a maybe a one-day visit or a couple hour visit, what the average tourist spends there, but it's hard to grasp that meaning. But at least for Hopi, we have that at our resource. It's one of those things that we can look back on and say, okay, it's more than a tourist destination for us. It's a pilgrimage. It's a place that we can interact with a big, broad spectrum of our ancestral past. So a lot of meaning there in the Grand Canyon.
Thank you so much, Lyle. That was an amazing perspective on your ancestral homeland that many people consider a national park, but need to realize how much it is a special home to people in the past and people today. So as you've shared so much about your connection to Grand Canyon, could you share just a little bit about Hopi culture and what you're hoping others might understand a little bit better about your background?
So, most people who come, to Arizona or the Southwest, they may see the term Hopi on a map, on an interpretive sign, and you don't get much from, just reading about it in terms of, those brief encounters with little bits of information here and there. What I'd like people to understand is that we've been here since the very beginning. One of my family members has stated, Hopi ancestors have been here since the time of creation. And so that's not taking it lightly. That's not just throwing out some whimsical kind of piece of um, romanticized history. There is fact behind that. And, over the years, we've been able to show that in greater detail. But what that really means is that we have a long, complicated, complex history in this landscape that just because if you look on a modern day map and you see the Hopi Reservation with its neat boundary drawn around it and it's detached from Grand Canyon National Park, that doesn't mean that we don't have that connection to this ancestral landscape. In the Hopi mindset, those boundaries are arbitrary. They don't really mean much to us because our stories, our histories, our songs, our prayers, all of those things that entail who we are as Hopi people, they wipe clean all those boundaries. They take them off the map because they connect us in many different ways. And so we're not just relegated to that past either. We're active participants in the overall management of Grand Canyon National Park. We're at the table, so to speak, and offering our perspectives in terms of how we would like to see this landscape managed. What are some of the, what is the information that we would like people to have access to? And that's part of it is that, yes, we were here thousands of years ago, but we're still here in many different capacities. We're still here as Hopi people, modern day Hopi people coming to pay homage to an ancestral landscape. But many of us, like myself, we have other roles within the whole paradigm of the national park there. And so we're archaeologists, we're scientists, we're guides. We interact with a larger, spectrum of everybody out there. And so, just because we're 100 or so miles, east of Grand Canyon National Park, doesn't mean that we don't have this strong connection to this landscape. And so, even though we're not there every day, although some Hopis work there at Grand Canyon National Park every day, this is still very much an integral part of who we are, and we still want to see respected and cared for in a manner, that respects not only us as Hopi people, but respects everybody else, because we're all in this together in that kind of perspective in terms of the management and protection of this landscape. And so, Hopi, we may have a big long history here, but we're also, again, we're just one part of the overall circle of many different groups of people, who have an interest and want to see this landscape protected. So for us as Hopis, that's kind of what I would hope other people who come, to the Southwest learn about us, is that yes, we're still here, we're still doing our part, and hopefully into the future, we'll still be given those opportunities.
I appreciate that openness you have of sharing your culture and how much Grand Canyon means to you and the Hopi people. These are some strange times to navigate, and generations before us have gone through similar ordeals. Lyle, have you heard of any stories from tribal members or how the pandemic affected them in the past, or any other illnesses that have come through the community? And do you have any suggestions to help people struggling today with the pandemic?
Well, I think indigenous culture and tribe here, what we call the United States, has experienced something like this in the past. Hopi, on a specific level, we know that we've endured smallpox epidemics, measles epidemics, any kind of physical ailment, that has been introduced into the new world. We've gone through that. And so I don't have very many specific stories per se from my family about how we endured some of those, other pandemics in the past. But I do know, during the 1850s and predominantly in the latter part of the 18th century there, Hopi was, as were a lot of tribes here in the Southwest, we did experience a lot of epidemics with smallpox and flu and measles and those kinds of things. The results of that was that many of the Hopi people living here, they moved, they left the Hopi reservation, they left the Hopi mesas and moved to relatives, either, in New Mexico along the other pueblos and stayed there for a number of years. Some folks remained here, but those who came back after, things had gotten better, they encountered a whole different landscape in terms of realizing just how much of the population was lost due to those, types of illnesses. And so um, this has been difficult, I think for many of us here in terms of enduring this situation we're in, because the thing for me, the thing I can speak personally to is that we've had no ceremonies or very little, and those are a huge part of our overall well-being. What is it besides physically taking care of ourselves? What are the mental and spiritual aspects of well-being that we need to ensure that we are healthy people? And so having that part of our culture more or less put on hold for a whole year has been pretty strange, and so there's been not strange, it's been hard, it's been very difficult for us, I think, because again, those are large aspects of who we are, and the coming together of the community, the well-being as a whole, hasn't been able to happen. And so we're all isolated. We still see each other, from time to time, but for the most part, we've been having to keep our distance and not be involved in those spiritual aspects, that hold community together. However, you know, out of those previous, historical instances, we know that we did survive, right? We're still here as Hopi people, as indigenous people. We're still here able to carry on, our culture. And so knowing that we were able to go through something like that in the past without the medical assistance, so to speak, that we have now, without some of the guidance, that we have at hand, gives us hope that, okay, yes, that there is going to be a day, somewhere in the future where our regular lifestyle, our cultural lifestyle will be able to come back and we'll be able to participate and be a part of that larger system again. And so I think that's just the lesson for us as Hopi people, is that we do have the resiliency, we do have the perseverance, the inner strength, the mental strength, the physical strength through this. Now, there are some things that we're able to do, that still are a part of the culture. And farming, agriculture has still been, those types of practices, we're still able to carry on, this past year, even though it's been extraordinarily dry again. I think, for me personally, this was a hard year just because we had a kind of a weak winter, moisture coming in, and then we had a late monsoon, which was relatively mild to non-existent. Um, there was definitely a lot of farmers who suffered because of that. But still, the act of actually going out and practicing our cultural traditions is still one of those, um, it's still an attribute that we have, that we can lean on and still say, okay, we still, even though we may not have gotten much of a harvest this year, we still did get some seed, And so the metaphor there is that we still have something to look forward to in the future. We still have those seeds that we got through a harsh time to carry us into, somewhere down the line. So yeah, I hope that, my communities out here and just across the board, that we're all looking to see that as humans, we've all been through this. And so, we just need to be able to kind of stick together as much as we can and look within ourselves, our own small groups, about what are those little tidbits of inspiration that we can have, to see us into the future. So for us here at Hopi, we're doing our part. It's still been impacting, our communities, our villages here, but we're hopeful that there's going to be a day where life as we knew it, will come back in some degree, and we'll be able to be, community members in that sense of actively participating, interacting, within our culture. And so, that's just kind of the hopeful that we have, and knowing that we've been through it before. And so, yeah, hopefully we're all mindful of that.
I really appreciate your perspective on these scary, struggling, and challenging times that people are going through, and that it's affecting us all across the world. And to hear that you've been talking about your ancestors making it through generations before, and hopefully giving us some inspiration to make it through as we see a light at the end of the tunnel. So to kind of conclude our interview today, I would like to ask you a final question. I know that you're still struggling as keeping that perspective as an artist, but you've gone through 14, 15 years of this amazing work, and I would just like to hear if you have any words of wisdom you'd like to share with other artists.
Again, be forgiving with yourself, and be willing to, you know, I I think as artists maybe, and again, still thinking of myself relatively new in that realm, we're all in this as individuals to some degree. We're all kind of battling our own mental roadblocks and obstacles about, is this good enough, or am I doing this right? And really, you just have to keep trying. You just have to make mistakes. How many times did I ruin a piece, because I rushed it, because I did something wrong. There's always something that you can learn from. And again, as long as you're willing to accept that, yeah, you're gonna mess up from time to time, but there's always a lesson, in that mistake. There's always something that you can take away from that. Even more so when you do everything right and you come out at the very end and you have a beautiful piece, that may kind of be a roadblock for you because you think it's going to be that easy the next time. And then, the next time shows you that it's not that easy, and that you do have to be willing to take each thing as it comes. I guess these are just life lessons, I think, in a way, that you just have to keep trying, keep moving forward, and for me, again, yeah, part of it is not listening to the critics again. I finally understand some of that, when I hear like musicians or other artists talk about the critics. There's always going to be somebody out there that says, oh man, I can do it better, I can do it cheaper, I can do it faster, and I'll sell it for a lot less. Well, that's great, go for it. That's what I tell them, go and do it, because in the end, at the end of the day, you really just have to be comfortable with yourself, and the work and the process, and the speed at which you're learning how to do this. So we all move, we all learn at different rates. And so, just because maybe, a contemporary of yours is learning faster or achieving greater notice on a greater level than you are, don't take that don't take it too personally. Just kind of always be within your own self, and be willing to just accept who you are, accept this is how you're doing it. And eventually, maybe, I think maybe now after 15 years, again, I'm kind of getting to that level where I can accept this is my process. This is how I do it. Doesn't mean that I'm stuck there, but it means that, I finally got to a level and a place where I feel confident about the work that I do, and being able to show it, to other people, and not kind of cringe about it so much, but I think that's just inevitable. I think for anybody that's learning anything new, is that being an artist is a hands-on experience. Again, like I said, you can't fake it. If you're going to fake it, then it's going to show. You really have to, be willing to give the time and energy to it, and realize that it's not going to happen overnight, just like with anything else in life. And so, um, just keep at it, and keep track of yourself, keep pieces of those early works, because that's a good way for you as an individual to gauge your own progress, because your friends and family are always going to tell you, oh, that's great, that's beautiful. But internally you may think, no, it's not, you're just saying that. But if there's some way you can track your progress as an artist, as an individual over the years, you'll surprise yourself at how much you're able to achieve and how far you come over all those years. And so yeah, be forgiving of yourself, and always find ways, to seek inspiration. So I think I'm lucky that my other career requires me to put the jewelry aside for a time, because I definitely need that away time from it to go out into the landscape and get that inspiration again from, whether it's the natural landscape, whether it's the cultures I'm looking at, or the other modern day contemporary indigenous people I'm interacting with. Those all feed into your creative process at some point. And so, be willing to step outside your boundaries, be willing to put it aside for a little bit of time, and know that it's always going to be there. If it's something you take serious and it's really something you want to do, you'll find the time for it. You'll make time for it, and it'll always be there waiting for you. And when your energy's right, you'll know it. It'll just be like you'll do things without even really thinking about it. It's almost like your hands and your mind are operating together without you consciously knowing it, and you're able to just make things happen, and you can sit back and enjoy that moment, and know that it's probably not going to be that way the next time, but that's the way it goes. So just keep at it, and work hard.
Lyle, thank you so much for sharing your perspective of your artwork and your experience that you've gone through. So I want to thank you so much, Lyle, for taking the time to share your knowledge, experience, and skills with us today. It's been an honor to have you be a part of our cultural demonstration program, and we appreciate your efforts in helping more people feel connected to Grand Canyon, its history, and its spirit. So thank you so much again for joining us today, Lyle.
Yeah, thank you all over there at the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon Conservancy. I used to be a board member, still associated with the group, the organization. It's a great organization. I want to thank you all for doing this on not only when we're able to come to, and be there actually in physical person. That's one of the greatest times for me, not only because of my connection to the Grand Canyon, but I think as artists, being able to interact with people and actively talk to them one-on-one in person, really enables us, to get a better handle of who we are and what we're doing, and see the different groups of people, that we're able to impact. And so just really grateful for you all and the work that you're doing. And in this difficult time right now, reaching out to some of the artists and giving us this opportunity. I always do my part to try and recruit other artists from my communities that, hey, this is a good program, even though it's kind of limited. The opportunities that come out of this are far greater than, you know, that one weekend that you're able to spend there. And so again, just thank you all, and I appreciate it, and hopefully we'll be there at the tower again sometime soon.
Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you, Lyle. We really do appreciate all of your dedication and your service and support to Grand Canyon Conservancy. So Grand Canyon's Cultural Demonstrator Program is made possible with grants and support from Grand Canyon Conservancy and Art Place America. And so for other artisans in this program, go to grandcanyon.org/demonstrators and stay tuned for more history behind the arts features on both Grand Canyon National Park and Grand Canyon Conservancy's social media pages.